Okay, hello and good afternoon. My name is Valentina Gabuzzi. Hello and good afternoon. My name is Valentina Gabuzzi and I work in the digital media division of Zanichelli. And I am also the editorial responsible for Zanichelli teacher training. I am very, very happy to welcome you to this webinar, which is about creativity and language teaching. And I am also deeply honored to introduce you to Mrs. Helen Legge, who is our expert tonight. Hello, Helen.
Hi, everybody.
So let me tell you something about our expert. So Helen Legge is currently co-young learner senior teacher at the British Council in Milan. And she has been in Italy since 1999, teaching both in state school and in the British Council, both from the north and the south of Italy. Is it right?
Yes, all over.
Okay. And her professional development has focused more and more on young learners as the years have gone by, with a particular interest in the integration of digital tools to support learning. And in recent years, she has developed an interest in the concept of creativity in English language teaching. And so she has presented on this topic at international conferences and teacher trainer sessions. So we really think that she's the best expert we can have tonight. So I will stop talking and Helen, it's your turn.
Thanks very much, Valentina. Welcome to everybody. I'm going to be basically talking a little bit about what creativity is for us as English language teachers, and also who benefits, integrate creativity, and how can we as teachers become more creative. I'm not really sure what people's ideas are of creativity. There is a lot of discussion about creativity at the minute, especially in education. There's a lot of conflicting ideas as well. But I think if Valentina just shows us the first definition, I think I have a definition on the slide which really does, I think, hit the nail on the head, as we say in English. It contains everything about creativity that I think is important, which has been created by what's called the C group, and C is for creativity. You can find them online. They work a lot with integrating creativity in the ELT context in particular. What I love about this particular definition is the way that it puts thinking as the first word. Because actually creativity is all about thinking. They talk about the fact that it is something which is novel, valuable, and open-ended. Learning in our students and also in ourselves. One of the key words for creativity for us as teachers is this open-ended. We are quite often trained and used to particular responses when we talk to students. And this concept of being a little bit more open-ended is really key for being able to integrate creativity effectively. And we're going to look a little bit at that later with more specific examples. It can seem a little bit at times that there's a conflict between this idea of creativity and what often our schools are asking us to do. There is this problem of preparing students perhaps for exams, and you know, we do tend to stick very closely to what is needed to pass a test quite often. But the secret is actually just about making the right choices in the way we plan our lessons and the way we teach them. And we'll come back to that very shortly. I'm actually going to go a little bit further, because being creative is not just about the teacher. It's not actually all about us all the time. What's really interesting is the difference between teaching, which is this idea of presenting our material in fun and innovative ways, and teaching for creativity. I tend to work on teaching for creativity. These are forms of teaching, as you can see here, this is a quote by Jack Richards, which are intended to develop young people's own creative thinking and behavior. And this is where we're trying to go. I think nowadays there's a lot of talk about creativity in the business world. We are told that employers are looking for creativity as one of the top skills when they're hiring people. This is also, I think, due to the fact that we live in this ever mutating digital world. And, you know, we need people to be flexible, to be able to come at which are new, because this is the new way of working. We need them to come to these situations with a flexible approach to be able to identify problems. Alan Maley, who is one of the people involved in the C group from before, and has contributed a lot to talking about creativity specifically in English language teaching. He actually talks about something which is called the imaginative leap. This idea that it's not just about finding problems, which is very commonly talked about, looking at data and looking at a situation and even being able to identify where problems may be or could occur. And that is something which perhaps in the past we weren't particularly well trained to do. As I've said, some people disagree with this focus on business in the future, and we should be preparing children for these jobs which may not exist. However, another side to integrating creativity, which is the aspect of creativity as something which enriches our lives and can boost self-esteem. This is really the part which I think for us as teachers, especially of children of age group, this sort of early secondary age group, is something which is so valuable for us. There's a really strong argument activity if we can actually start to think about the way that it benefits young people. There's Dr. Kaufman, who was interviewed about creativity, and she talks about this fact that creativity brings intense personal enjoyment. It brings engagement and it gives meaning. That's a very powerful thing if we can integrate it into our learning contexts. Alan Maley, who I've mentioned before from the C group, he talks about creativity with its ability to stimulate, motivate in a deep sense. So creativity is a skill which is useful for the future for business. But we also have to look at creativity and this benefit which it gives us and our students, because it's also something which benefits a teacher, students. This immediate, really rewarding feeling of applying creativity to the teaching context. So everyone benefits really when we start integrating creativity. So just imagine the potential that we could harness here for this kind of powerful tool in our learning contexts. That's really the kind of the background to the creativity idea, which I'm going to be focusing on today. And I'd like to just start moving towards more about how we can become more creative. There is this, this idea that it's something which is integrated into our activities, but it's not something you can just add on to your lesson. It's not a decoration stuck on. It's a very deep and yet very subtle change. When we make this to our lesson and our lesson preparation, the effects are huge, but it's a very small, it starts with a very small change. And one really important aspect of integrating creativity is what we say in the classroom as teachers. And we tend to, we tend to talk about the same things all the time. We tend to give praise to students. We tend to give instructions to students as teachers. So do this, read that. Tend to also quite often look at, for example, questions which specific answer for. So, for example, in the list that Valentina's showing you now, we have the typical questions, the typical teacher talk, really, that we find in most contexts. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with these phrases, because I don't think that there is. But if we want to integrate creativity, we need to look at how we can modify them slightly. So, for example, we have things like the typical, is it true or false? Typical praise here, good, well done, very common. And obviously things like, what's the past participle of such and such? We tend to be very focused on linguistic specific detail. And you may think that's perfectly normal because we are English teachers, and you're right. But we're going to be looking at different ways of getting the same results. Also things like when we correct students, or when a student gives us the wrong answer. Of something here which I say a lot, and I admit this, the penultimate phrase. So, okay, yeah, okay, but that's not really what I'm looking for, because I'm asking a question and I already have an answer in my head that I want to hear. Classroom at all. There's a wonderful expert in this who is called Rod Bolitho, and he talks about this concept of artificial questions. As teachers, we spend a lot of time asking our students, we already know. It's not a real question for something. And he really encourages teachers to move towards what he calls more learner-oriented talk, about building in opportunities for learning and thinking. These kinds of things, although they're very typical and they function, I mean, they do what they need to do. We are managing behavior, we are giving instructions, we're moving towards a learning objective. And these kinds of phrases all do that very well. Make them better if we want to become more creative.
Can I ask you something? I mean, when you were just, listing all these questions, I was just thinking that this is the classroom language that we all interacted with when we were students, I mean, as learners. And now we are using these very same schemes and way of interact as teachers. So it is something that it is deeply rooted in our memory, in our way of behave. And so I presume that changing these habits is not easy at all. So, I mean, what do you suggest? What are the best strategies?
I think that's so true. It's not easy for anybody to change what they do, especially because, as you've said, our experience of learning, these are the kinds of things that we've always heard ourselves. So now when someone asks you to think about changing that, it's normal that people get a little bit anxious. I suggest starting with something quite small. So for example, a really effective way to start is just considering the way you praise your students. It's a really easy change to make. It's not affecting classroom management too much. It's not really going into developing things like, what we're aiming to do. So just start with something small and really think about noticing the effect that it has. Share also this idea with students that you're trying something new. because this is something I'm going to come back to at the end. Don't be afraid to tell students you're trying something out. It's actually exactly what we expect them to do. Sir, you should be modeling what you expect your students to do. Show them the behavior you want to see them display. You'll be surprised. It really does create a sense of trust. And I'm going to come back to that later because that's extremely important. But we'll come back to it because I think we need to get clear before we start discussing that. So Valentina, have you shown them? You've got this is more effective and creative teacher talk. Difference. I mean, instead of just saying describe the picture, I'm now asking you to look at the pictures and tell me how they are connected. Connecting and making connections is an essential part of creativity. It's one of the fundamental bases of creativity. Understanding how things interact and are linked. And it's perfect for teaching. Everything, we build on. So constantly making this reference to how things fit together is appropriate. But if you notice, they aren't dramatically different to the phrases from before. It's a very subtle change. You want to move away from asking for specific answers, these empty artificial questions, and allowing students to actually contribute something of value. If you remember the definition at the beginning, they talked about something which is novel and valuable and open-ended. Kinds of questions allow those things to happen. For example, I've taught a lot of exam preparation courses for students. So things like PET, first certificate, and everyone says, it's really hard to build creativity in when you teach for exams. And I said, I don't think it is, actually. Instead of saying what word fits that gap, you just need to ask them, can you think of that fit that gap? And they're also really easy to adapt for levels. These may seem a bit sophisticated, but it's really easy to change them. If you look at something, if you imagine asking a child, how many words can you find for the gap? And the gap is a sentence like, and you have a space. Middle school children will be able to give you a range of places where people live. And I think it's a really easy way then to discuss which ones are more appropriate or which ones are valuable for the context you're talking about. So they may say things like, I live in a tent, I live in a caravan, I live in a flat, I live in a house. They can probably contribute significantly to that kind of gap. The rest of the context, you can actually ask them to develop some better learning skills by saying which one is most appropriate for this context. So not only are you actually growing vocabulary, you're teaching them to evaluate which ones are most appropriate. And that's a real world task as English speakers. Who am I talking to? How formal do I need to be? What are we talking about? Which word is most appropriate? It really opens up a lot of other skills when you start going in this direction. Also things like, which answer do you think is best? Instead of which answer is right. Because, maybe there isn't such a thing as the perfect right answer. There are always exceptions, especially we all know English is full of exceptions. So maybe we should stop telling students that there is this one right answer and start moving towards, let's evaluate the options. Moving down a little bit, you'll start to see the last three in particular, the last four. This again is about making connections to things we've done. Now, not only is this creative because we're looking at how things fit together, but it's actually an example of effective teaching practice. Research shows that by helping students make connections and building on what they already know, improve their learning. So things about asking them to connect, for example, some language. I don't know if when they start to learn about, for example, the present perfect, how does this connect to what we know about the past simple, for example? So they're building on knowledge and adding blocks to what they already know. The last two are also equally essential. What isn't clear about this? That all your students are following you all the time. I mean, we all know that that doesn't really happen in reality. But it's important to stop and ask them. Check what your students are actually doing. Check how much they're following what you're saying. And just say it. So we're just going to stop for a second and check that you guys are all on the same level with me. So these, moving in towards a more creative approach, a more open-ended, I don't want to say a more relaxed approach because I don't think it is. I think you have to really consider what you're going to say. But it opens up really a world of learning opportunities, not just linguistic, but also ways of studying. So this kind of learner autonomy, this idea of considering previous knowledge, they all combine to become a much more effective way of learning for students. So I think you really start to move in a much more rewarding direction. As you can see, all of these examples ask students to think. The case in other examples from before. So we're trying to get the students to actually think about what, not just about the language, but about their learning in general. And that's not a difficult thing to do. But as teachers, we just need to become a little bit more aware of the quality of what we say in the classroom and the impact it can have on students' learning. Really a major, major shift to make as a teacher who wants to become more creative. And it takes practice. And it's not easy. And it is a case, as Valentina said before, of practicing and trying out things and sharing with your students that you might not get it right all the time. And that's okay. Considering reflecting as a teacher, how did I change what I said today and how effective was that? What worked and what didn't work? And that's all part of a process of becoming a more aware and a more creative teacher. So, doing that as much as you can. So I'm going to move on now and actually talk about what I have done, build in creativity. I've kind of tried to divide them up into different categories. And the first one, as you can see, is about creativity through objects. Two images here, obviously, because in the classroom, I can bring in an object. I mean, here I have got a slightly strange object, which is in my house. This is a good example. It's important that you show students objects which are a little bit ambiguous. Although it doesn't always have to be, but it helps. So what I want to do is welcome novel ideas. For example, a really easy task to do is, here's a strange object. Give me a list of 5 things that you could use this object for. Easy. What's important as a teacher is that you don't try to guide your students too much. Just let them say crazy things. It's fine. I mean, if they're applying English and they are responding enthusiastically to a task with English, then we can work with what they come up with afterwards. But that's an example. So make a list of 5 things is a really easy task, which can be quite creative, because what is this? Because they don't know. you know, it's a strange object. How are they going to know what it is? The whole point of using a strange object is to say, give me some ideas of what you think this can be used for. They're going to look at the shape. They're going to look at the size. They're going to consider different things. Give them the language that they need just to discuss it. So I think it might be these kind of basic things. Then they can carry out the task and add in their own ideas. I've given another couple of suggestions for this kind of lesson. I mean, again, it's an activity. It's an activity in a part of a lesson. So what would you change about these objects? Tell them what it is. They don't need to know what it is, but what would you change about it? Material that it's made from. Would you change the size? Anything is possible here. It's just important to start this process of taking risks in the classroom, saying things which aren't the norm, that aren't the kind of usual things we always say. Stating the obvious, basically, and giving students this freedom, unusual ideas. Another really nice task linked to this kind of thing is, how would you sell this object? And here you have a potential proper task-based lesson. You have to create a whole background to what this object is, what it's used for, why you want to buy it, why you need it in your lives. At the very end, do I tell them what they actually are? And it's just a really wonderful moment when, you know, it's often very surprising, and it's just really rewarding to see how close they get to the real thing. Here, for example, these two objects. The first one is it's an antique spice grinder, so for pepper or something. And the other one is fabulous, and I've never found something quite so unusual. This was actually a door alarm. Wedge at the bottom of the door, and when someone moved the door, it would chime, it would make a noise. So it's quite a small object, really. But what's really interesting is the way that the students approach the task and the freedom which allows them to contribute really unique ideas. You might think I'm neglecting the language, but I'm not. Because all kinds of language items can come out of these kinds of tasks. Make a list of what it can be used for. It could be used as. It might be, of course, you're going through some modals. What would you change? A lot of vocabulary there, talking about size, talking about material. And of course, the selling is a much more communicative, introducing this idea of persuasive language as well. So there's a lot of potential. I think as teachers, we can sometimes get a little bit insecure about working with language, about just giving students a task and seeing what comes up. As long as we're clear in our heads about where we need our students to go and what kinds of abilities they need to apply to language, then every opportunity gives you that option of being able to find something useful. To another one, this is a bit of a homemade task. As you can see, this is a picture I drew. I'm very creative, as you can see. This was a task which I adapted from a course book reading, a reading and listening, actually. A typical course book that we use a lot. I won't name names, but it's very long text about friendships and relationships. So I showed them this picture, and I asked my middle school students one question, and it was, what has happened? Students all got together and they were working in groups to try and think of, you know, responses to this question. So, you know, I helped them a little bit. I said, how do you think they're feeling? You know, is someone perhaps to blame? Is, you know, what do you think has happened? And I think what's interesting is that as teachers, we shouldn't really worry about students not coming up with answers, because as long as you create a situation or an atmosphere in your class where encouraged, your students will always come up with an answer. You shouldn't really be in a situation where someone's going, I don't know. What's happened? The answer I don't know is not a valid answer for me. So it's about nurturing this idea of being able to give your opinion without being criticized. So it's a very important aspect of creativity. My students came up with a very long list, and I've got just a few examples from that list. Things like they fell for the same girl. Intermediate students, so they had a nice, quite a good level of English. But again, the nice thing about doing tasks like this is that students respond with the language they know. Work with that. You can make it a bit higher level. You can add in some phrasal verbs. It's up to you. But being so open-ended allows students as best they can. There were things like, oh, one person, this is a friend, and they've let their other friend down. The friend's disappointed for some reason. Perhaps one friend has told some lies and spread some rumors. Things like they might have had a fight. It was obvious that there was some kind of problem. Working with that, once I had a list of suggestions, and making a list, although it is a lower order thinking skill, it's a very useful place to start. You need a list of suggestions, and from that list you can build up better, higher order thinking skill tasks. So a very simple thing to do once you have a list of suggestions is to ask students to rank them in order. So I said, okay, great, now we have all of these options, and I simply said, I want you to rank them from the most important in a relationship to the least important in a relationship. So they had to go through things like spreading rumors, falling in love, falling out of love, being annoyed about things, and they all went through. Now, particularly difficult task, but ranking is a great way to engage high order thinking skills. They have to constantly evaluate what they're saying and justify their, and they're comparing constantly. It's a great, easy task to bring up from a list or from a of words or concepts. So again, they come up, they go through this. We're talking about higher order thinking skills. Creativity a lot of the time is about trying to move, or rather than move towards, trying to see opportunities for higher order thinking skills. Creating is one of the higher order thinking skills. I'm very aware of the criticism of using things like Bloom's taxonomy too much, basically. But I think it's about finding balance. It's the same as everything. There is a time and a place for lower order thinking skills and a time and a place for higher order. We need to make sure they are balanced, and that's the main thing. So that's a typical task that's very easy to do. Really, really easy task, which is about reviewing language. I've given you a really silly example to show you how easy it is. Little tasks that create problem-solving situations. Again, it is a really silly task. So a student has a banana, but as a student, you really want the orange, and your friend has an orange. Sorry, that should say has an orange. What can you say to get the orange? Problem, basically. You don't have the thing you need, somebody else does. How can you get the thing you need or want from another person? Obviously, I've said, what can you say? Because violence is not an option. So this is about trying to engage some persuasive language. And also this idea that you can use any idea at all. I don't expect something in particular. So again, this very open-ended, very free task for students to contribute to. What's nice about this task is that you can substitute the fruit with vocabulary that you've been working on. So for example, I could say to my students, you have a t-shirt, want a pair of jeans. Your friend has a pair of jeans. So what can you say to get the pair of jeans? And it's about teaching students, you know, to highlight qualities, to come at something as basic as a t-shirt or a banana approach. Make it sound more interesting. You want to swap this fruit with your friend or this t-shirt with your friend. It's just a fun way to get students warmed up, really. A nice little review activity that you can build in very, very easily at the beginning of any lesson, just to get them kind of into the English mindset again. But again, you know, uses other skills. So things like problem solving, persuasion, this kind of thing of we're moving beyond just purely linguistic aspects of our teaching. And moving towards, I mean, I'm sure everybody here has heard of life skills. This is all part of that. So is into just our typical classroom routine. One very, very easy way, and I think as language teachers, we all know how important images are. A very easy way to build creativity into our classroom is through the use of images. Away from this typical question of just describe, describe, describe. There is so much potential in images. We have two images here in particular, which are quite similar. They show two similar things. To compare them. I mean, that is a kind of leading up to exam practice. If you're heading in that direction with your students, a nice task is about comparing images beyond just what we can see. We have a lot of potential in these kinds of images. So, you know, as teachers, this is where we need to be a little bit creative and think about new ways of asking our students to produce language. So, for example, you can simply say, chef. You know, you could say, you've just had a meal here. You've just had a birthday party. Write a note to the chef. I'm not telling them what kind of note. They can choose what they want to add to their message. And it's a note, it's not a letter. They also to contribute to a shorter text initially, and then you can build that up to something else. But it's just an initial reaction. Like in the first very famous picture, you can look at other things there. So what can you buy in the shop across the road? What's in that shop? You can even go further. Go into the shop. Choose something. Choose a present for your teacher or your friend. What present did you buy? Tell me why. Compare with your friend. Which one is best? So much potential. Once you actually get into the mindset, you'll go a bit crazy because really it just becomes something that's very difficult, if not impossible, to switch off. Another really nice thing, and this is going a little bit back to the objects before, about selling the objects. Exactly, the last part about, sorry, I can't remember, but I do have it written down. Yes, how would you sell the objects? There's a nice one here for these images in particular, which is make a suggestion to improve business. Yeah, see that last one there? Make a suggestion to improve business here. Because, you know, there's not a lot of people in these bars and these cafes. Why not? What do you think you could add to this? In the area where you live, or in this area where we go to school, find a business you think could be improved. You would improve it. And if you really want to take it to real life tasks, get them to write a note to the people. An anonymous note, if they want to. Just drop it in. Anyway, you know, it's about here to open a dialogue with the students in your classroom. why do all of our students have to write the same things all the time? Why do we have to get them to do, everyone has to write the same content? I mean, I understand that as teachers, it can become a little bit more challenging for us who have to mark things. But in some ways, it's nice. We have a bit of variety. So write a note to the chef. The variety that you're going to get out of that will make your marking a lot more entertaining. And, it's up to you about if you are preparing students for a kind of exam, you can tell them, okay, this time it's a free, open task. Next time, I need you to add certain things, and you'll have to check if you've done that or not. So, there's no one rule. We don't have to do one thing all the time. So that's a particular example of images. And we're going to probably look at images very quickly later as well. Next one is about using sounds and music. And I really wanted to share a website which I found, which is fabulous for creativity. And this is going towards the...
Sorry, can I just ask you something?
Oh, sorry.
Going on, because there's quite a debate on the platform between all the teachers listening to your ideas, and they are all very excited about your advices and tips. But one of the I mean, some of them are just reflecting on the fact that one of the problems they have at school is that many students, they don't really master the language for the task, and their vocabulary is very poor. Yes. So, I mean, how can they, as a teacher, how can they help students that maybe are weaker than others, or maybe they don't really have enough words to do all these wonderful activities?
I think one way of managing this is to actually allow students to prepare in stages. So let's say I have 2 students, and I'll say, okay, you guys, I want you to think of ideas. I want you guys to prepare a short, I don't want you to actually write the note. I want you just to make a note of your ideas. So what things are you going to contribute? What I call them keywords. So what we have to do as teachers is break everything down. I'm really aware that there's a lot of differences in level quite often. Teachers, we have a responsibility to try to what we call scaffold our tasks as much as we can. That doesn't mean, it kind of goes back to what I said before about the fact that using an open-ended task actually allows even weaker students to contribute in some way, because they can use what they do know a lot, then building in a stage where they can work with other people and perhaps share some knowledge, get some vocabulary from their friend or partner. And also, let's not be afraid of asking them to use dictionaries, or to refer to texts that they've used in the past, to look at their material that they've used to study, to look at their textbooks. Our learners to actually use resources that they already have to create something. This is something I have a lot with primary students as well in my particular job. It's this idea of trying not to give students too much. Tell my students, you need to write this. And if the student says, what's this in English, what's this in English, what's this in English? I want my student to use his book, to use the resources around him, and to provide me with a minimal response, but which shows the best of his ability. Excuse me.
Don't worry.
Sorry. So I think as teachers, I understand completely that we are expected to bring students to a particular level, but there is only so much we can humanly do. So if we can't bring the students up to that level, allow for some kind of and production that will also allow a weaker student to produce something of value, something of relevance. I think if you ask a student to write a note, a weaker student could simply say, thank you for my sandwich. I really enjoyed it. Maybe that's a bit complicated, but it was. And so you're working off two very basic sentences, and just building in some small things around that. You could say something like, friends about your restaurant or your cafe. I think as teachers, we need to be really clear on telling students what is the minimum expectation from them, but allowing then the stronger students to really quite linguistically challenging texts, but not forgetting that there has to be an access point for weaker students. I mean, this is the whole concept of inclusive learning, about differentiation, about taking students and allowing every student to have some kind of learning experience as best they can. So I understand that entirely. And I think, again, that's something that goes back to when we're planning our lessons. We need to consider how we can adapt the task for a student who perhaps isn't as able, or also provide resources. A lot in my lower level students is actually give students the language they need, which people might think is strange, but I'm going to give them a selection of things they can use. The fact that they are starting to take these on board by using them appropriately in their task. I'm not writing the task for them. I'm saying, you could say, thank you for my sandwich, thank you for my soup, thank you for my something. It was delicious, it was good, it was, and just giving them that selection of things. You know, you can write up on the board, you can do it as a brainstorming with the other students. They then have a bank of resources that they can take from and provide you with a text of some kind. And then that's, you know, they can build on that slowly and gradually. I think we have to, as teachers, adapt to some extent. So I do appreciate that, but I think we also have a responsibility to try and meet our students as best we can. So I'm not sure what timing we've got. Okay, yeah, we're okay. I think we can manage the others. So yeah, great. The other one of the other things that I was talking about before is about using sounds and music. And I wanted to share a website which is fantastic for something which perhaps would be more traditionally creative, if that makes sense. This idea of creative writing. Which again, if you're not sure how to start out being creative, it's a good place to start. It's an easy place to start. It's quite, it's kind of in its own box, if that makes sense. And then you can start to branch out. So one website that is fabulous is this website called Noisely. There, you don't have to register to use it. It will ask if you want to register. You don't have to register. It's free, and it allows you in your browser. So in any browser in your classroom, to build up sound effects. The weather, you can hear, you know, rain falling, or you can hear a thunderstorm in the distance, and you can adjust the volume. And what I've done with this is, with a group of children, we were talking about writing stories in particular, so narrative tenses. And I got them to listen, first of all, and think about what they could hear. And I asked them some questions. As you can see, these are just some examples. So where are you? What has just happened? Something. How do you feel? So we're bringing in some more vocabulary about emotions. And now, what are you going to do next? And you can just literally play a series of these noises, and they all blend together. It's not like press one, press the other. It's this constant music and sound going on in the background. And it's a really nice, motivating way for students to really start to use their imagination. It's really nice. You can also select things if you want to kind of guide the story. So you know, you can start off quite, you know, nice and light and birds singing, and then become a little bit more sinister. You can do that as a teacher if you want to do that. It's very, very flexible. What works really well with this, again, is making sure that we've brought we've done enough work before we get to this point and produce something, depending on their level, again. But once they have produced something, what I find is really effective is to display them on the wall. So, you know, this also encourages students. Actually, research has shown that if students know that their work is going to be read or looked at, they will already make much more of an effort in the planning stages. So it's a really nice way to up the quality in your classroom. You can just literally, with a little bit of, you know, blue tack or white tack, I can't remember what it's called, you can just stick them around the room, and then you ask students to walk around. Story, for example, that is most similar to their own, most different to their own if you want. And it's just a lovely way for students to actually not only prepare a text, but then they're going through the same kind of vocabulary and the same kind of grammar again by reading, but they're reading text from their peers. They're much more motivated to read from, you know, their peers' points of view. It doesn't have to be perfect. I wouldn't go in at that point, though, to correct other people's work. Just literally face value. We're looking at the message. We're looking at the story. And a really a nice way as well to perhaps represent the connections that you want between stories. For example, what's the connection between your story and your friend's story is with a Venn diagram. You know, the overlapping circles. You can put down what things have in common, and in the others, why they're so different. And it's a nice visual organization of thoughts and concepts, which really works well in a creative context. I use them a lot. So that we are all trained to do comprehension questions, or you know, when we're listening, we have to really look at specific A, B, or C answers. But a Venn diagram is a great way to respond to a text, whether it be written or listening. Again, for multiple levels in the classroom, it's a nice way to make your students also feel like they can contribute and perhaps build their confidence a little bit. So instead of asking them very specific questions, we're looking more at general understanding. So, you know, I think we need to build those stages into our lessons and to these very productive free tasks. I understand can be an issue, but there are ways we can help students get there. One of the last things I think we're going to talk about is this idea of making connections. And I think you probably recognize some connections going on in various things I've talked about already. And a Venn diagram is a perfect example of this. Here are two images which I used in one of my lessons. You know, in the past, I would have said, here are two pictures which show people receiving some kind of award. But now I don't. I just say, here are two images. What have they got in common? And it's a really high question to anything. You know, really, genuinely, what have they got in common? It can be something like both people are wearing blue, or there is a man, at least one man in both pictures. You know, we need to look beyond the obvious sometimes. It's about trying to build up connections. So about awards, and then we went into why these people may be receiving awards and what kinds of awards they're receiving. This was linked originally to a written text. The schoolboy on the left produced a project, and it won a very important award in Ireland. And I got my students to actually read the original proposal. And another really simple task to become a little bit more creative is to ask your students to read a text, and while they are reading, to write. So things like, what questions would you ask this person who did this project? Or just using the images. Would you ask anyone in those pictures. It's just a really nice open-ended task. You can focus on question forms if you want to take it linguistically in one direction. But again, opening up this idea of student-generated tasks, and instead of just going through the usual comprehension questions we find in a book, introduce this idea of my students are capable of asking questions and capable of reading a text and reacting with questions. It's also a real-world task. It's what we do. We consider things, we ask questions. So we're training students to apply their language skills to their own context. If you have students who are very low level, they could even ask the question in their own language. You know, there's no reason why. I know there's a lot of debate about using Italian in the classroom, using L1 in the classroom. But when you're talking about weaker students, what we're trying to do is make the learning accessible. So there's no reason why at that point you couldn't say, you can ask me the question in Italian to, obviously, because what's important is that we want to understand that they have understood something from the text. And so rather than forcing them to provide you with the question in English, which may be beyond their ability, let's first check their comprehension, and then we'll work on the other parts. My students came up with some amazing questions when I asked them things like, how much did he win? Was it a low budget project? What was the aim of this project? And you know, those are all questions that are really, really valid and perfectly realistic. The idea of asking students real, authentic questions. Let's ask our students to produce them as well. So is essential. The very last thing I'm going to talk about today, really, really quickly, although it is fundamental if you're going to move into some kind of nurturing of creativity in your classroom, and it's about creating the classroom culture that allows it to happen. Set expectations. And what I mean by that is by telling students what you expect them to do, and also creating a safety net. Feel comfortable in taking risks and saying things that might not be normal. You know, a class contract is a perfect way to do that. We will respect each other's ideas, but you have to be careful because you also have to be really, really involved in that process. You as a teacher need to really consider the way you react to your own students' contributions. Sometimes it can be fun or easy to, you know, joke with a student about a contribution. You know, I often do it. Often it's fun and we all have a laugh. Really consider what we're saying in classroom in response to our students' contributions. And we're building this idea of trust, and that if you want to tell me something that may be a little bit strange, we're going to do it anyway. No one is going to laugh at you. Things like, instead of telling students they're wrong, I've given you a couple of examples here. You know, so this is it sounds amusing, but actually it's really effective. So when a student gives you a bit of a strange response or something that perhaps isn't expected, things like, oh, interesting point. How did you come up with that? Where did you come from? Or there's an idea I hadn't thought of, which is a great way to think. Things like, if I look at it from a different point of view, I can see what you mean. What's important here is that we don't want to squash students' contributions. We need to value what they say, even if they may not be exactly what we're looking for. The thing I'm going to say about creating this culture, and I've mentioned it before, is that as teachers, we have to model this behavior ourselves. We need to demonstrate this thought process. So things like I said before, trying something new today. Share that with your students. Or let's see, we're going to write an essay today. to write an essay, then I need to think about how I'm going to start my essay. I need to think about what I'm going to say, what language I'm going to use. This kind of spoken thought process is extremely useful for students. Again, it's one of those aspects of effective teaching, this idea of giving a useful model. So going through a thought process and verbalizing it, so your students will also be able to do the same, is extremely valuable for all of these kinds of tasks that we're talking about. The answer isn't the thing we're really focusing on, as in the actual content. What we need to look at is the way our students are thinking about what they're contributing. Obviously the language that they're using, but teaching is sort of moving towards more open-ended contributions, which we then feed in with correction or with linguistic, let's say, tweaking. But what's important is that your students feel comfortable communicating, and creativity, as we've seen before, builds self-esteem. It is motivating in itself and gives a sense of satisfaction. We really need to try and harness that in our lessons, and it will benefit us as teachers, but our students as well.
Thank you. There's some questions about, so the first question, can you see me?
Yeah.
Is what kind of activity can you suggest for students with almost no vocabulary? This is a question from Renata, and she's thinking about like prima media kids, so very small children.
Yes, I teach a lot of children in primary schools, so I understand that they don't have a range of vocabulary. I think what we need to think about there is, again, what I mentioned before, if we can give our students some structures and some vocabulary to begin with, and as a class, if we can talk about, I mean, it doesn't take a long time to think about, for example, alternatives to the word good. We have a phrase and we say something simple like, it was a good holiday. Easy way to build synonyms or alternatives even. It doesn't have to be good. If we're going to talk about good, we should also talk about bad. Really, what I think is important is that we look for little opportunities to do before we go into these more open-ended tasks. And we have these records of vocabulary also visually or materially written down so that students can refer to them when they're then doing the task. It's about building in pre-productive creative tasks, little tasks where we can help our students have some language. I think we have to be careful though not to overload them as well. So it's about choosing maybe 4 or 5 options and then building in a task where they will then apply them immediately also. So to be a long session building up to one creative task, it could be quite short. And as long as the student has a record of these words, then they have something they can constantly refer to. So I understand, I think if you are in prima media, you're working with prima media kids, you do need to come at these with a lot more scaffolding. But I think that the reaction, the consequences, they build up quite quickly. And if you're learners to become more autonomous, when they say, what's the word for, then you can say, look in your book. We already wrote this down. If you want to go crazy, you could even keep these kind of vocabulary diaries where they're divided by content or by topic. You have something to refer to. They might refer to it 2 or 3 times, and the 4th time they'll remember. Because I think we have to remember learning is a process, time, and we can't expect them to be immediately, but we can provide them with lots of opportunities to apply things so that they can which helps them, sorry, to remember them in the future. So yeah, again, it goes back to this idea of scaffolding tasks as much as possible. That's a whole other webinar.
Many teachers are suggesting that word clouds, especially, for example, some tools like Word It Out or things like that, can be effective in this process of building up vocabulary.
I think people have done the course with seeing some of the material from Mari, and there's also a lot of mention of Padlet. Padlet's the perfect example. You could actually create a class dictionary, you know, like little topic bursts, basically, similar to word clouds, but multiple in one place. So the whole class has this one resource that they can all use constantly. It's great for homework because you can access it from home. There's all kinds of things. But yeah, word clouds are great. Word clouds are good. They're a really nice way to build nice, memorable visuals. So yeah, absolutely, great idea.
Another question points out that students at that age, in middle school, they are quite afraid of, you know, exposing themselves to other peers. And so sometimes when you just you gave an open-ended question, you just have silence.
Yes.
They are asking if it is better to work in groups and then gathering.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. I mean, I totally understand. I totally agree. And again, I do think this way of building up the relationship of trust as a whole class takes some time. So it's not something that we can do at the start of the year. But this idea of the class contract can really help that. This idea of, and have it on your wall and refer to it when people step out of line or, you know, make a comment about someone else's contribution. This is something that I think is really valid as teachers. We need to build this feeling of I'm safe, I can say things. But I understand that as pre-teenagers, that's already a problem in itself. There's different things you can do. I think working in groups is a great idea, so they can share this kind of collaboration and then provide us with an example. There's also the idea of they don't necessarily have to say it. Quite often we use, you know, just like an A3 piece of paper on the wall. They can walk around and add their ideas on the wall. It doesn't always have to be verbal, but yes, I totally understand. I think it's a process, again, that takes a little bit of time. Some students will never contribute because they are absolutely terrified. One really nice tool, though, for that, if you want to go digital, if you can go digital, is a site called Today's Meet, which is basically an apostrophe S and meet in a sense of meet people. It's a back channel tool. Basically, it's just a running space where students can contribute their ideas. And it just comes up in real time. Now that, however, you need to be careful and make sure that everybody knows exactly how we respect the tool, and that because it can be anonymous, and so you can get people making cheeky remarks. But again, that's kind of you as a teacher who needs to establish that kind of expectation and also follow things through. So if students are abusing a tool, then you need to stop using it and tell them, I'm not using it anymore until you can prove that you're going to be able to do that. And literally put it away for that lesson. Use something else. Plan B. Because they need to learn, and the more you do that, then they'll start to learn that they need to behave in the right way. But any back channel tool is fantastic for quiet speakers or embarrassed students, because they can contribute to an actual discussion in real time without putting themselves out there, without drawing attention to themselves. So if you've got technology, a back channel tool is a fabulous way of doing that. But pen and paper works equally well.
Okay, so I speak on behalf of all we are more than 120. I mean,
wow, yeah. On a holiday.
Into your webinar.
It's a holiday weekend.
They are all very happy, and they all really thank you for this useful class.
Thank you. So thank you very much. I really enjoyed it.
It's been an honor, and I just want to add that in your slides,
Yes.
which are already on the platform, there are all these references and links. So teachers can just, you know, choose all your tips and ideas, and also go deeper with this kind of links.
Yeah.
So
Can I just say that? Sorry, I just want to say the Padlet that you can see at the top is basically just a collection over the past sort of 5 years of resources that while I've been developing this interest. So everything I know is there. It's for you. You can all access it. It's a really great place just to keep lots of information specific to creativity and ELT. So I recommend, feel free to go in and download everything.
So I'm sure that, like, starting from tomorrow, there will be strange objects in classrooms, and also great fun between teachers and students. So really, really thank you. So
thank you very much.
Goodbye to you and to all our teachers. Thank you very much.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.